The feudal future podcast.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we are delighted to have live from Israel, Jacob Siegel. Jake, welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be back.
Jake, as you may remember from having been a previous guest on the Feudal Future podcast, is special features editor at Tablet and a former U.S. Army intelligence officer, longtime journalist. And today we're going to be exploring the topic of censorship of the press. Jake has a new book out called The Information State. That's being published by Henry Holt, to be available in March 2026. You can pre-order it now. But this is an area that has captivated him as an area of research and captivates us in terms of understanding where we are today in the world of censorship. So, Joel, do you want to kick us off with the first question?
Yeah, the first question really goes to the heart of your book, which is we're living in an information age. It was originally thought that the digital revolution would really allow for a freedom of expression that was unprecedented and allow for lots of players to have access. In the information state, since I've read it, that didn't seem to come about. What do you think has happened to the information revolution? Do you think it's been hijacked or is being hijacked?
So I wouldn't use the term hijacking because that suggests that there was a proper and perhaps even virtuous path that the information age was supposed to follow, and then it got commandeered by terrorists, hijackers, nefarious forces of some sort.
I mean, like Google and Facebook.
Precisely. But remember, you mentioned this sort of high point of optimism in the internet age, and Google and Facebook were the faces of that high point of optimism. So the internet freedom agenda, as it was known, which was a really sort of a benchmark of the second Obama administration, presided over by then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. It actually started in the first Obama administration. It was all about how only tyrannies and corrupt dictatorships censored social media and censored the press, and it upheld totally unconstrained free access, global access to social media companies like Facebook and to search engines, indexing services, informational services like Google as the kind of as the criteria for political freedom. This was the meaning of the internet freedom agenda, was that states that restrict internet access are categorically, definitionally unfree. And so the US government was using its full diplomatic might, economic pressure, the kind of full assortment of soft power tools to promote the global spread and indeed the global dominance of these what are in effect information monopolies like Google and Facebook. Now, of course, the punchline to this story, this sort of cruel twist, ironic twist, depending on how you want to frame it in narrative terms, is that Hillary Clinton is the person who is most responsible for being the kind of face of this when she's Secretary of State. And then only a few years later, when she runs for president, she becomes the very face of the idea that the dark forces of disinformation have so totally penetrated and taken over the internet and hijacked the brains of American citizens that it's now incumbent upon the government to censor the press, to censor social media in order to uphold what is euphemistically known as liberal democracy or election integrity. Now, democracy, which when Clinton was Secretary of the State was equated with an open press, a kind of open, unrestricted access to social media and the internet. Now it's the very reverse only a few years later when she's, unceremoniously defeated by Donald Trump in this upset election that totally catches the entire kind of institutional elite, very much including the establishment press in the US, off guard. So the one, actually, just to add one thing to that, what I would say is, the purpose of this book, my new book, The Information State, which is coming out in March of 2026 from Henry Holt. You can pre-order it now. The purpose of the book is not to defend um, the earlier Clinton version of the internet. I think both Clintonian internets, both the totally optimistic internet cheerleader, internet freedom agenda that she was promoting was, in my opinion, very much diluted about the kind of downsides of the informationalization of the political process. And also the response to this years later, when it came time to decide there had to be a war against disinformation, because it seemed that the same social media companies, which were supposed to be promoting progressive politics, all of a sudden became, much more suitable, at least in the short term, to promoting an insurgent populist in the form of Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, for that matter, on the left. That was a very short-sighted and, I think damaging reaction insofar as it normalized censorship as a kind of political value among liberals, but also the earlier version, the Obama Clinton version that promoted the creation of these gigantic information monopolies like Facebook and Google as, the bedrocks of a new, more free, more prosperous digital age, which, as we know, as you've both written about, really gutted the private sector middle class, this digital economy. These are two forms of a bad idea. It's they each are
unintended consequences
right.
taking over.
Yes.
Your line of reasoning opens up so many questions to me. The one that I wanted to start with was the question of original intent. So your argument is that there was a freedom agenda, let's promote democracy, free thinking, or free expression around the world, and that was really what motivated the Obama-Clinton version of all of this. Was there an economic agenda there as well, in the sense that if we promote this, everybody's going to need to buy American technology, and these companies are going to be American that control the global flow of things. So let's make sure we get our market share as high as possible. Do you think that was any part of the discussion at all?
I think that was absolutely central to the discussion. And it was at the very core of the discussion. And furthermore, that kind of economic primacy that you're talking about was totally inseparable from the view within the Obama faction of the Democratic Party in particular of the basis of their own political power. So Obama comes to office in 2008. He wins this election as a kind of relatively unknown outsider without that much political experience. Maureen Dowd in the New York Times refers to him as a virgin, politically a virgin, because he's relatively unknown. He comes to power as what is known as, the Facebook campaign. This is what brings him to power. And he commands this unbelievable following in Silicon Valley from very early on. So he gives some of his first political speeches, his first campaign speeches in 2006 to a Palo Alto Google audience. His relationship with the Google crowd and with Apple is very tight from the very beginning. And of course, Silicon Valley is pumping, a tremendous amount of money into not only his campaign to get him elected president initially, but then into the Democratic Party machinery that he builds, which is a new kind of Democratic Party, which is systematically replacing the old, and what was then, to be fair, already faltering, FDR post-New Deal version of the Democratic Party, which had already started to come apart, Private sector labor unions obviously were in decline long before Obama came to power. But that old version of the Democratic Party coalition, white urbans, blacks, other ethnic minorities, private sector, middle class, working class, labor unions, now gets comprehensively replaced by a new version of the Democratic Party, which is much more of a kind of top-bottom coalition and places the Silicon Valley tech companies in absolute pride of place. So that's one version of political power that relates to the economic power.
Well, and just a quick sidebar on that. Roll the tape ahead,
Right.
and look at the continuance of technological primacy for American tech in the form of AI, and you have the exact same economic relationships developing with the Trump campaign, with all of the same tech bros that were waving their hands
I have to challenge that a little bit. I mean, the people who are still behind the Democrats tend to be on the software side. But what's happened is the tech bros, I think, have, I think part of what happened is, and maybe this is part of the story we need to tell, is when there began to come both antitrust moves, which in some ways I'm supportive of, but also when they're like, for instance, in AI, I think we had this discussion the other day. They said, well, there's going to be two companies who are going to do AI. Well, every venture capitalist and entrepreneur and all the other companies are saying, we don't want this. So what I'm really concerned about is what changed. And I think Marshall's making a good point. Silicon Valley in 2008 was solidly for the Democrats and Obama. By 2024, that had begun to unravel. What do you think caused that? What changed the nature of the information industry to become more bifurcated than a solid, front?
Okay, so let's take a step back and then I'll work forward to that, because I think it's important to understand, what is the tech industry in America? What role does it play in America? Can we look at it as being the equivalent of other private industries like manufacturing, for instance? And the answer in brief is no, because from the very beginning, the tech industry, the high tech industry, especially in the form it takes after World War II, is a strategic industry. So from the very beginning, it is tied into the military defense sector in America in a way that is not simply relational, but is, in other words, it's not just that it's mutually beneficial, but that is generative of the products it's creating, because the government, the US government, is actually providing the strategic direction. So one of the most obvious examples of this is the radar industry and the microchip industries, which come out of this intense research, industrial, military, scientific apparatus that's built up to win the Second World War, that's phenomenally successful, we should add. In winning the Second World War, it's an experiment that succeeds in enormous and decisive ways. So especially in terms of developing new anti-aircraft technologies to deal with the very powerful, very deadly German Luftwaffe, the Air Force. And then these technologies that are developed during the war and the kind of research triangle that's developed to first fund these technologies from the government. So the government provides the direction, then the research laboratories, often at universities, do the kind of R&D and the analytical work, and then they in turn are connected directly to commercial companies who then take these products to market, and this then comes back to the government. The government gets these products that it can then use in warfare. That's the World War II model. It continues through the Cold War and is in fact intensified in some ways in the Cold War. And then something happens. What happens is that, for reasons that I describe in detail in my book, but are beyond the scope of this talk, the internet, which begins as a military research project. That the origins of the internet are, which I go into detail about, are really in Vietnam, and it's both a Cold War project that's intended to provide a communication system that can survive nuclear warfare and allow America to retain a command and control system even in a nuclear exchange. But it's also from the very beginning tied into the idea of building what its kind of conceptual father, J.C.R. Licklider, describes as a universal library, so a repository of all knowledge. And by mastering this database of all knowledge, which the US is going to create, it'll be able to anticipate political and threat developments across the world. This is in the very origins of the internet. There's this idea, and Licklider talks about creating a man-machine symbiosis, right? This is how he sees the internet. So that's the model that we have for most of the 20th century. And then this strange thing happens, which I said is beyond the scope of our talk now, which is that this incredibly powerful military research weapon, research tool, however you want to look at it, but something that's clearly military in its origin and applications, gets privatized. First, it gets handed off to a non-military branch of the government, the National Science Foundation. And then the internet, which began as this military research project, gets privatized and commercialized. And when that happens, that's when we get the real origin of what we think of as this kind of libertarian Silicon Valley hacker culture, where the government not only needs to leave us alone so that we can innovate, but the government's a kind of obsolete technology. This is the
well, exactly. Just to interrupt you for a second, the technological parable of this, or parallel of this, is the move from the glass house of mainframe computing to the distributed model of PCs for everyone, which, thank you, Bill Gates, and thank you, Steve Jobs, enabled everybody to kind of take on that guise as the individual contributor / hacker / innovator. And that suddenly created a massive distributed network that still connected everybody, which is really fascinating. That hadn't happened before in human history.
Right. A stroke of brilliance, you might say. So you go from having these massive hulking mainframes that sort of physically announce their connection to the government to, what's known as like the personal computing boom. So it's this incredible reversal, right? Where the sort of classic example of this is the advertisement for the Apple computer in 1984, right? Where this early version of the Mac personal computer is advertised as being a bulwark against tyranny, a bulwark,
right.
Own an Apple computer so that you can fight Big Brother. So this is,
by the way, that commercial showed once on the Super Bowl in 1984. It was only aired once, and then canned, which I find very, very interesting. But it was exactly what you're talking about, Jake. It was a bulwark against and a flare against tyranny, against concentration, and it heralded the age of computing for every man.
right.
So what happened to this libertarian or liberal view? How did that begin to fade? How did that translate into a kind of surveillance / censorship culture, which frankly, even on this very, very mild broadcast, we were canceled once for something unbelievably stupid.
So the short answer is the real pivot in the relationship between the tech industry and the government, or the second pivot, you might say. The first pivot is away from this government, military, computer research complex towards privatization, libertarianism. The second pivot is 9/11 in a one word or one phrase. And what that does, what the war on terror does, is reconnect the central government, the national security complex, directly to the emerging tech behemoths, and that's, Google at the time, certainly, but then very shortly after, Facebook as well, Amazon's
Well, and
around it.
with Palantir as playing a very important role in stitching together the information repositories so that they're accessible to be able to find terrorists before they do bad things.
And Anduril here in Orange County is a huge
that's
player.
Today, right? Today we are now dealing with a new world of AI-driven drones and weaponry, but information was really the key when 9/11 came around. Well, who are these guys? Where are they? How do we find them? Right? There's just so many Mossad agents exactly that you can have.
And I have a whole chapter in the book where I talk about a program called Total Information Awareness, which was the government's attempt to build. This was a DARPA program, Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, which is at the very sort of heart of the internet, of creating the internet originally, and is behind a lot of the most groundbreaking technological developments of the last, what would it be now? I'm going to get the math wrong. Let's say 60 years, maybe 70 at this point, actually. But so DARPA funds this project called Total Information Awareness post 9/11, which is the government's attempt to build what it calls a database of databases. So it's the super Google that's going to consume all information everywhere. And by all information everywhere, I mean everything from library records, of taking out books, to commercial transactions, to, commercial internet surfing habits, to biometric data that's fed into a database. All of this is going to go into one database. And that database then is going to do what's called predictive analysis. And this is what Palantir is founded to do. And it's essentially augury. It's a form of auguries. The ancient Greeks would assemble the entrails of birds to divine signs of the future. And this is the sort of...
And then sacrifice a few people, maybe we can... that'll validate the read. Funny. I'm sorry.
No.
Well, the Aztecs got there.
Arguably, a few people are sacrificed in this version as well. But
right. Exactly.
We won't get into that now. But so that's the sort of premise of what total information awareness is. The larger story is now, 9/11 reconnects the government to Silicon Valley and the technology industry, but Bush is still an unpopular figure in Silicon Valley. So what the Bush administration does is it creates what Shoshana Zuboff calls a state of surveillance exceptionalism.
Right.
The state of surveillance exceptionalism allows these technology companies to become the behemoth information monopolies that they are, under the premise that doing so advances U.S. national security interests in a time of war. And there are reasonable arguments for some of this, but we get the consequences now. So that creates the conditions for this tremendous growth. Then what Obama does when he comes into office is he takes this unbelievably powerful globe-spanning machinery of surveillance and control, and he totally rebrands it by attaching it to his own new party vertical and progressive politics. He takes what the Bush administration had effectively assembled to fight the war on terror. I don't mean every instrument of fighting the war on terror, but I mean the kind of infrastructure in terms of this new military-industrial complex. And then Obama brings it inside of the party, and he attaches it to his version of progressive politics, which from the beginning stresses informational hygiene, as you might call it. The idea, as Obama expresses in an early speech to a Google crowd, when he says, what the public needs is just more facts and reason. We need, these are busy people out there. When they get bad information, they do crazy things like, I don't know, opposing my healthcare plan or like not voting for me or whatever, to gods and guns. And if we get them the good information, the right information, they'll make the right decisions.
Right, so by the way, I seem to recall the phrase truthiness. Was that from him in that campaign? Remember, we were talking about things, fake news, and facts that did not check out, and so there was a move to increase truthiness on the internet. And I don't remember whether that was him or whether that was Hillary that actually came up with that line. Anyway,
it certainly could have been him. I don't know for sure, but I do know for sure that he expressed this view a number of times. And then this new machinery of informational control, as you might call it, which is really, the combined sort of reality shaping power of the social media companies, Google as the dominant search engine, together with a few other key internet hubs, they now create a machinery by which it is possible to centrally shape, if not outright dictate, what information the public receives. Now, there's one more step just to complete the answer to the question Joel asked, and that is the next thing that happens. So now Obama has taken this internet machinery built in large measure as a kind of extension of the U.S. national security state. Then it goes commercial. Obama now makes it appealing to liberals, to progressives. And then the next step is that machinery, the internet, swallows the media. The traditional press goes into a state of total collapse, and it is effectively swallowed whole by these social media companies. So anyone who worked in journalism over the last 2 decades can tell you not only that the industry has gone through a absolutely massive contraction, something like more than half of all jobs are gone over the last 2 decades, journalism jobs. Local journalism is effectively wiped out. You get this massive centralization of journalism in hub cities. Those hub cities happen to be directly connected to the tech industry and the kind of billionaire financiers. And now, if you want to get a story read, initially Facebook has to promote it, has to show up in Facebook's newsfeed, has to show up in a Google search, it has to be promoted on Twitter. So the social media companies become the publishers effectively. They swallow the news business whole, they become the publishers. And all of that sets up the situation in which, when faced with what is perceived as an existential threat in the form of Donald Trump, this new machinery of combined military, media, commercial, governmental information control can be used in a very tightly coordinated way to advance one party's interests at the expense of another party's interests, and to really comprehensively censor the news that's reaching Americans. And just to provide an anecdote that illustrates the extent of this, most people are aware of the fact that the New York Post story, the New York Post, the longest continuously running print newspaper in America, founded, or might be the second longest running, founded by Alexander Hamilton. And the New York Post, many people know, its coverage of Hunter Biden's laptops, which was really about the sort of corrupt business deals that the Biden family was involved in, which was clearly intended as a kind of political October surprise to hurt Biden's chances in the elections. The social media companies censored coverage of the Hunter Biden laptop story. People know this. What they might not know is Twitter actually censored private direct messages in which people were sending links to the New York Post story. So here you have a social media company. Did not know that. A social media company that rose to popularity, because of promotion done by the star of Dude, Where's My Car, Ashton Kutcher, and it's censoring private messages sent by people sharing legitimate news reporting, whatever you thought of Trump versus Biden, totally legitimate news reporting done by a newspaper founded by Alexander Hamilton. So it's just the clearest possible example of the inversion of the traditional news pyramid.
I got a question for you about that. That case where Twitter was was censoring people's direct messages. How was that affected by algorithms that were detecting natural language usage in specific messages that people were sending, or was that curated by humans on top?
It's almost certainly both. So, a lot of it was simpler than needing to use even the natural language detection because you were looking for a link. But the natural language detection could help you find those instances where people had found a way around the link by
Yeah,
using a service archive.org or something like that. So in most of the cases with these things, it's most of the censorship is algorithmic at the sort of at scale, it's algorithmic, but the determinants, like the keywords telling the algorithm what it's scanning for,
was
um,
obviously developed by humans. Yeah.
right.
So,
And the edge cases are made by humans.
Mm-hmm.
so right now, I mean, it just seems that we hear less about censorship. I mean, whatever, as our friend Ron Spogli once said, we live in the bizarre world where only the fascists believe in free speech. Which basically the internet is much freer under Trump, it seems, than it was. Well, they're not censoring stories. That is not happening. It was happening before, but I mean, whatever Trump's authoritarian aspects are, the internet is not being controlled the way it was. But what I was wondering is, are we seeing, and when Trump, it will go away at some point, when Trump is gone and the establishment is back in power, will we see something in the U.S. as we are now seeing in Europe, where and the U.K.? I assume you've been following that,
Yeah.
and obviously the worst case in China. Are those the models that we may be going towards?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that's likely in part because, the Trump administration seems to be doing a lot of things that might set up a Democratic president to win in
Right.
2028. And if that happens, I think we're likely to head back towards something like the European model. This is not something the Democratic Party believes it can give up on. This form of anti-democratic information control it's in its DNA at this point. But I want to address something else because this is really crucial. I agree with Joel. I think we have seen a decrease in censorship online that's dramatic. And yet, as if to prove the point that the disinformation warriors were making all along, the internet is as psychotic and destructive to democratic politics as it's ever
Right.
been. I mean, the social internet. So, what we've seen is that the sort of language of free speech and the language of anti censorship has been, in part, absorbed into a new kind of political apparatus, I would say headed by Elon Musk and headed by Twitter, in which you can sort of promote schizophrenia in the public sphere at a nuclear scale and then defend this in the name of free speech. And my argument has always been, going back for more than half a decade now, the argument I have always made is that a focus on anti-censorship is not enough because the fundamental structure of the internet is damaging to democratic self-government in ways that, I think the two of you have outlined in terms of the ways that it has eroded the middle class basis of the economy. For instance, there are analogs to that. The ability to have a kind of reasoned discourse between citizens of a democratic polity where you argue over things and compromise and negotiate and reach some form of consensus is not possible in a global information system. I'm not somebody who's like anti-technology on absolutist grounds. I don't consider myself a Luddite or anti-technology at all. But I think that the internet as a global information system, that is one which, from its inception, was intended to efface national borders is incompatible with the national sovereignty that's necessary for, sovereign democratic nations to
Yeah,
exercise
that's interesting.
I
political.
completely agree with you. But let me offer let me put my economist's hat on for a moment and offer an economic perspective on all of this. And it kind of gets back to what you were talking about earlier in terms of the destruction of traditional media. Traditional media's role and the role of an editor in the traditional newspaper or whatever was to ask the question, what will the most people read? Because I'm trying to build an audience of the largest number possible. And so my job as an editor is to figure out what is it that the most people will read and then publish that, right? Today, the algorithms are exactly making the opposite argument. The algorithm's role as the new editor is, what do people read?
Each person, each individual person.
Well, and the point is that in the old days, when you were looking to massify the number of people reading, then you had to choose to optimize for that. Today, we're finding it's actually not a zero-sum game. It's not either in the paper or not in the paper. It's these people like this and these people like this, right? This started off, this whole world of collaborative filtering started with Amazon and saying, if you like this, then you're going to like that. So the point is that the algorithms are now building niche audiences.
Right.
And then their job is to say, how do I build the most number of members of that niche? We'll let somebody else worry about the other niche. That guarantees polarization. That guarantees fragmentation. Right. And that's what the problem is that we're facing.
Yeah,
right
I mean, actually, the students have said to us as well. They said that, if you have been getting certain kinds of media, all you get is that kind of media. So sometimes I have conversations, or my wife has a conversation with somebody, and they say things. They said, where could you have possibly gotten that information? And by the way, it happens with people on the right and on people on the left.
Yeah.
They just, if all your information is coming essentially from NPR and CNN and New York Times, you're on a different planet than somebody.
The Newsmax people and right, exactly,
and the Fox people. So this has been a great discussion. We're running low on time, and of course you have to go run do something else. But where do you see this all going? If you were going to project in the next 5 years, what should our students be expected, particularly with the additional accelerant of artificial intelligence?
In terms of the media in particular, or
in terms of the idea of free speech and censorship and
I think that there's going to be a collapse in the currency of free speech. I think that the value of free speech has been broadly misunderstood. What the internet has done, what the global internet has done, is to make noise equivalent with speech. But when the founders talked about free speech, what they meant was that in order for citizens to participate in self-government, in the determination of the decisions that affect their own lives, in the sense of the republic that, Tocqueville describes, it's civil society in the sense of what Tocqueville calls the slow and tranquil action of society upon itself. That kind of speech can only occur at a certain pace and scale, right? So it requires people who share a set of common premises, who are willing to listen to each other. It requires a pace of discourse that allows for the absorption of new information and a kind of dialogue pace. That's not what the internet is. I simply don't accept that this is about free speech at this point. I was anti-censorship. I'm still anti-censorship when it's being applied to the press. But the idea that a global schizophrenia machine, which is what the sort of social media has become, Twitter in particular, is some sort of bastion of free speech, is absurd to me. I don't support it at all. And, I would like to see these monopolies brought to heel. And so, unfortunately, however, if that doesn't happen, and I'm sorry to say, I think it's unlikely that that'll happen, what you're going to have is more and more noise pumped into this informational system at scale, especially as AI makes it possible to not only produce convincing facsimiles of different voices, but to target those voices at different audiences in the way you were talking about, Marshall, but now at scale because it's being driven by AI. When that happens, what you're going to have is a kind of collapse in the value of free speech. What's the point of participating in any sort of speech-based exchange if you can never judge the worth of what you're hearing because you don't know if it's coming from an actual human being or a bot, and that'll be very bad for democratic societies.
Well, and so welcome to the new age of the Tower of Babel.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway, Jake, this has been a spectacular conversation. Thank you so much for doing it. I can't encourage people more to go out and get a copy of The Information State. Again, Henry Holt is publishing it. It'll be available in March 2026. You can pre-order it now. Thank you so much, Jake, for being part of the Feudal Future podcast. We look forward to having you back.
That was terrific.
I'd love to come back. It's always great talking.
Thanks.
The Feudal Future.